Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Preserving African American Burial Sites, which is the third webinar in our 2022 webinar series, Preserve the Past, Build for the Future. We are recording this session and it will be available on the ACHP's YouTube channel shortly. I'm Susan Glimsher. I'm the Director of Education, Communications, Education, and Outreach at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the economic, educational, environmental, and cultural values of historic preservation, and also advises the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. The ACHP is comprised of 24 statutorily designated members, and we are the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of our work is overseeing the Section 106 review process of the National Historic Preservation Act. That requires federal agencies and all those receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. This webinar series fulfills several important aspects of our mission: to educate the public about historic preservation, to bring the next generation of preservationists into the field, and to build a more inclusive preservation program. We have had and continue to have a great lineup for this series. Our first webinar was about finding careers in historic preservation and in related fields. Our second webinar talked about interpreting enslaved individuals' history through historic sites. You can watch the recordings of these sessions and the one we're doing today at the link that we've just posted in our chat. Our final webinar for the series this year will take place on April 27th at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join us for natural disasters and their threat to historic preservation. You can register for that webinar at the same link you registered for this one, and we're also putting that link in the chat to make it easy for you as well. We are excited about our guests today, one of whom is Paul LaRue. Paul, do you want to join us? Paul LaRue, an award-winning retired high school teacher who founded a preservation project for the Gist Settlement Cemetery in rural Highland County, Ohio. The settlement was built by formerly enslaved individuals in the 1830s. We are also so pleased to tell you that we were contacted by U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Paul's elected official, who, upon hearing that Paul was participating in this webinar, wanted to send a message to all of you and for all of us who support this important work and are committed to continuing it. So I am just going to put the senator on and let you hear from him now.
I'm Sherrod Brown. Earlier today, I was joined on a call by Cincinnati Vice Mayor Jan Michelle Kearney. She's a Cincinnati native whose family has deep roots in the city. She's seen how sites like Union Baptist Cemetery have not been, frankly, been dishonored, and we simply haven't preserved them the way that we should. Union Baptist is this historic place where Black Union soldiers and civil rights activists and former slaves, so many other Black Ohioans, have their final resting place. We've not invested the resources we should to preserve this hallowed ground. A few years ago, I joined Cincinnati community leaders to visit Union Baptist and see the work that needed to restore this burial ground of a place of honor that it was meant to be. We worked with the community, with civil rights and veterans groups, to introduce bipartisan legislation with Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, to preserve these historic Black burial grounds around the country. We got it passed in the Senate, but not early enough to pass the House, and unfortunately, Senator Alexander retired last year. So this week, I'm introducing a new bipartisan bill, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act, to provide federal resources to ensure sites like Union Baptist are preserved and maintained for future generations. It would set up and fund a program through the National Park Service. It would provide grant opportunities and technical assistance to local partners to research and identify and survey and preserve these cemeteries. I remember when I visited Union Baptist, local leaders showed us graves of Powhatan Beatty, a former slave and Civil War veteran who received a Congressional Medal of Honor, Dr. Jenny Porter, the first African-American to receive a graduate degree from the University of Cincinnati, so many other great Southwest Ohioans. Cemeteries like Union Baptist don't just matter to those people whose ancestors are buried there. They're important historical sites. They're tools for education understanding. Think about student groups studying history in the classroom, but going out and seeing these cemeteries and seeing the graves of Civil War veterans and escaped slaves and others, and what their teachers can teach them about that and the exciting history that they really don't always learn. Last month, we brought in Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian, for a virtual Ohio event focused on the history we can learn from these burial grounds. He talked about the past, and I want to give you a quote. He said, "The past is a mirror that makes those who are often invisible more visible. It gives voice to the many that are often overlooked." Imagine what students could learn on field trips when they have that kind of insight. Black history is American history. It's true not only in February, Black History Month, but throughout the year. There are historic Black cemeteries all over this country. There are hundreds in Ohio, many of whom I've not seen and aren't very well known. They help us tell stories that have been ignored or stifled for too long. It's not a partisan issue. We passed this bill in 2019. As I said, I'm working with Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, the other sponsor in my updated bill. I'll keep working to preserve and protect these historic sites so future generations can learn about the profound impact those laid to rest have had in shaping our state. Thank you again.
In addition to Paul, our fantastic guest speakers today are Tyrone Wilson, the Harambee Executive Director, who is working on an amazing project, the Pine Street Cemetery in Kingston, New York. And we are also being joined by Keith Stokes, a preservation and interpretation of God's Little Acre, Newport, Rhode Island. And this is the largest intact colonial era African burial ground in the United States. So that will be fascinating. Before we turn to Tyrone, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. At the end of the discussion, we will ask for questions. And when we call on you, we'll turn on your microphone and you can ask your question directly of the speaker. So now, again, welcome, and let's turn to Tyrone Wilson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you all for having me here. I really, really appreciate this. And I think that this is such an important topic, such an important time to bring forth, which I call giving voice to the voiceless. So I'm going to start real quick and just say that my name is Tyrone Wilson. I am the Executive Director of an organization here in Kingston, New York, that is called Harambee. Harambee is Swahili, which means the coming together of people. In 2017, I started this organization just on the fact of wanting to have an African-American festival here in Kingston, New York. I felt that Kingston was so rich in African culture, and to not have that culture be told, these stories to be told, that culture to be exposed, I decided that I was going to bring an African-American festival here to Kingston, New York, which did happen in 2019. But in this journey, when Harambee was created, as I said, it was just to do the African-American festival. But in the journey of creating the organization, something happened, and something kind of just fell right on us. And this was now, which we call the Pine Street African and African American Burial Ground that's here, which in 2018, the site was put on auction. At the time, the Kingston Land Trust, which is a land trust here in Kingston, New York, was researching land and came upon that this site was an enslaved burial ground that was put on auction. And on the auction, it was not listed as a burial ground. It just had the property that was for sale. So I was approached and immediately was asked, can I help do something about it? Because this site cannot be auctioned off. And of course, absolutely, there was a no-brainer for us at the organization to step in and figure out what we needed to do to save this land. So a little bit of story about this land. I'm going to just share my screen. I'm sorry here. I don't know if you all can see that.
We can, Ty.
Okay, great. Okay, so real quick, this is the picture. The house right now is actually what the house looks like now. This house was in really, really bad shape. So we had to totally renovate the house. And this house is in the back of this house is actually the burial ground itself. So in this process of the purchase, and before I go into the purchase, I want to give you a little history about this burial site. It was as you see, in 1750, and we are finding that this burial site actually has a possibility of going back almost to the 1600s. As we're doing further research. As you'll see, the trustees of Kingston identified an area outside the wall settlement of Kingston, formerly was Woodwork. This was to be used as a burial ground for enslaved Africans, where they may have been buried since the 1660s. African people who were enslaved and around Kingston were denied church burials. So just like many other enslaved Africans, they all over was not allowed to have certain burials. A lot of the burials was just placing the remains in the grounds and cover it. They wasn't allowed to have no ritual prayers or anything of the sort. And that's kind of happened throughout, all over the country. Wherever you found enslaved burial grounds, the formats has been the same. 1827, slavery ended in New York State. The North, New York State was one of the last states to release the enslaved people that they had here in New York State. New York State held about well over 21,000 enslaved individuals here in New York State. In 1853, the burial ground was sold to private owners, where the borders of the city of Kingston expanded into the surrounding rural area. A lumber yard was built on top, but the graves were not relocated. At this specific burial site, which we now are the stewards of, almost directly across the street, with about 4 houses down, was where the Duchess was buried at. And over here, where the Duchess was buried at, there is a medical facility that's there right now. But before they built the medical facility, they removed all the graves and relocated them to the Old Dutch Church. As you see here, they did not remove the burials of the enslaved Africans here. They sold it, and then they just built on top of it, and it became a a lumber yard, and also a horse cattle and other things throughout the years. There were several things on top of this land, with it knowing what this land was about. So just that's important to know too as well. So in 1990, so there were several attempts to purchase this land. We had Professor Joe Diamond and a Kingston historian, Ed Ford. They was doing searching maps. They had maps, and so they were searching for different areas. They discovered they rediscovered this land. And this is how all this came about to the present of why we here right now in this matter of this site. Was because of Joe Diamond and Ed Ford's work. As they was doing map discoveries, they relocated this site and found that this site was right here. So directly across from the house directly across from the burial ground, which we own, there was a basement, and in the basement, this is what started all of this. In the basement, there was bones that was found. It was given to the local police and sent for testing, and it came back as African origin. So that kind of re-sparked everything to what has happened to this present is these bones that was found in the basement next door. And then Joe Diamond did some more research and realized that they are actually sitting right on an enslaved African burial ground. On May 23rd, 2019, we campaigned. So we started a campaign in we started the campaign in November of 2018. We decided that we found the bank. So we had to do a lot of research because the landlord who owned this property was in foreclosure. So there was some agreements that we had to make with him. So we had to locate the bank, and we found the bank, and the bank was located all the way in Minnesota. So there were several conversations and several attempts to plead to the bank just to give us the land. We want to preserve this land. We told them what's there, and we wanted to preserve this land. So they didn't want to just give it to us. So basically, we had to buy it. We had to purchase it. So every year here in Kingston, New York, my organization, we do a whole month-long celebration of Black History Month. So we have about 45 events in the 29 days of Black History Month, which we have events happening every day of that month. And what I decided to do was to use that time to draw a campaign to raise the funding to purchase this land. We started the actual campaign started in December, and we actually December, and by I think March we had finally generated enough money that we needed to purchase this land. So it was in May 23rd, 2019, we purchased 157 Pine Street, and it's a property and array of it that came with it in Uptown Kingston, forever protecting the long forgotten historical African burial ground contained within. So just, paint the picture that, here's a property that's known now in the city of Kingston knows it. Everybody knew of this land, and, we still had to fight to preserve this land. So I want to move forward real quick. So I want to show you, this is a celebration, a libation of when we made the purchase. And we use a slogan called "Owning Life, No Longer Owning Death," because we feel that we are the descendants of them, and they're no longer owned in the land, and they're free. We felt that their spirits is free. So I just want to show you this real quick, and just bring you to the celebration that we had.
Ty, there's so many people. That's wonderful.
That's okay. So, as you saw that was the ceremonial celebration of now freeing the land. We had well over 80 something people that came out that attended this event. And as you heard me say in the talk, that this was really a community coming together who understood the importance that we cannot let this land be auctioned off or sold any longer. And you know, I am still to this day so grateful for this community and understanding the importance that, you know, these are important people. They are human beings, and they deserve the right to have their stories told. They contributions, you know, to this world, to this land, to these areas is very important, that we bring that forward and share that with everyone. So one of the things that was close to my heart is always youth and working with kids and young adults. So one of the things I wanted to do for the site is that I wanted to design what this site was going to look like, you know, as we get to our goal in. On March 10th, the youth design team presented their final design proposal to the community after 5 months of community engagement, investigation, and design. These individuals, high school students who spent 5 months, we paid them 5 months to come up with a design of what the burial ground was going to look like. They traveled, they went to New York City Memorial, they went all over and researched and came up with an amazing design of what this is going to look like in the coming years. So we very much was including our youth. This is our campaign. This is one of the campaigns. We did a gala. As you can see, protect the African burial ground. Our ancestors are buried here. So we campaign, I mean, hard and long. And these are some of the people that was involved. And when you see us not smiling in this picture, that was on purpose, because we was like, you know, we was not happy that we had to really purchase this. So, you know, this is us. And you know, I mean, this was a team and many more, but I thought it was important to share that with you all. And now, you know, we are open, you know, to the public. The site is going to become a museum. And as we gathering up more of who's buried here, we're going to tell that story. And people come, we do a Juneteenth celebration every year in front of the burial ground. I'll stop that. The burial ground is also, we have a farm project that we have there. And just know that we did called a GPR, ground penetration radar, that we wanted to make sure that they was there, because they was using languages like possible burial ground, you know, could be a burial ground. So we wanted to change that language. So we actually did the ground penetration radar, and we can see that they are there. And we look forward to, bringing it forth as long as everybody else around the world and in the country. And I thank you all for having me. I hope I didn't kill the time, but I try to be as fast as possible. But thank you so much, Susan and the team, for having me.
Thank you, Tyrone. It's pretty hard to get everything of importance in a brief chat, but hopefully people will go to your website. In fact, you want to put that in the chat?
Sure.
That would be great, and learn a lot more because it's a brilliant, brilliant project. So now I would like to welcome Keith Stokes from God's Little Acre. Welcome, Keith.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Keith Stokes here in Newport, Rhode Island, and I've been a longtime steward of God's Little Acre, which is an African heritage burying ground section of Newport's common burying ground. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes explaining 400 years of history. I'll start with the Africans themselves, how they arrived, and more importantly, how they would come together and form an association, one of the first of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, that would help extend and create a burying ground. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we restore, interpret, and most importantly, celebrate this very sacred place. So this quick presentation is entitled Stories in Stone, How We Preserve and Interpret a Colonial African Burying Ground here in Newport, Rhode Island. And Newport is home of a very historically important burying ground. In fact, this burying ground itself was organized back to 1705, but many of the burials actually predate that within the larger burying ground, which dates back to 1640. By the mid-19th century, the African-American community started to call this section God's Little Acre. So today, this section that has nearly 400 original markers dating back to the 17th century that reflect African heritage people enslaved and free in the history of Newport and the history of America. And I think it's important, as I provide you an introduction of the burying ground, we talk about who the Africans were. Very few people would realize that between 1705 and about 1807, Rhode Island, the smallest state in New England, was the most active participant in the British North American transatlantic slave system. In fact, my community of Newport was the most active slave trading center in all of British America before the American Revolution. And we've been able to access primary sources and documentation, ship logs, diaries, tax records, where we've identified at least 672 sailing vessels that left Newport during that time frame. And then they would travel to West Africa, bring enslaved West Africans to West Indies, and then eventually back to Newport, what today we call the triangular trade. What we also know is that most of these ships landed in what at the time was called the Gold Coast. Today we recognize as Ghana. So the majority of the Africans would eventually land as enslaved Africans to Rhode Island and Newport, originated through the Akan and the Fanti people of Ghana. My own ancestors, who are part of God's Little Acre, were directly related to the Akan and Fanti people of West Africa and Ghana today. It's also important to understand that as we've been going through these primary records, we've been able to recreate and retrace the very origins of these Africans who are now buried in Newport's God's Little Acre. We know that many of them originated from what is called Ananabo, a large slave fortress at Fort William. We also know that many of them were originally Ashanti and Fanti tribal members. And one of the most important cultural considerations that has survived slavery and exists to this very day, that's very evident in this burying ground, is a tradition where if you're a child, if you're an Akan child, and the day of the week or the birth order, you're given a day name or a birth name. So if you're a boy that's born on Sunday, your name is Kwasi, which anglicizes into Quash. If you're a boy born on Friday, it's Kofi, which phonetically it's pronounced, or it becomes anglicized as Cuffy. There are hundreds and hundreds of Quash and Cuffys and Members and Jobas, all buried not only within God's Little Acre, but across where Africans are buried across America, and particularly across the West Indies and Barbados and Jamaica. So by understanding these day name traditions, we're able to recreate the very lives and African culture of men, women, and children who are so much more than just slaves. They're flesh and blood human beings. They're our ancestors. And one of the things that we've been able to, in retracing and really understanding the very markers that are here, is that as early as 1745, enslaved Africans across New England, in Newport, Providence, Rhode Island, Bristol, Rhode Island, Hartford, Connecticut, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Massachusetts. They would come together every June, and under an Akan festival tradition, they would organize and they would elect a tribal leader, a leader for that community. So even though they're enslaved, they are organizing and following Akan traditions and selecting a tribal leader. These tribal leaders were called by the larger white community a Negro governor. But what's most important is we have primary records of hundreds of these Negro governors or African tribal leaders all across New England. And many of these same men would later become buried and become a part of these African burying grounds. The image that you see here is Pompey Brenton, who was one of a number of Newport African tribal leaders. If you look very carefully at the marker, you notice that the image has African features. Newport Burying Ground has a very unique aspect where Africans themselves would become stone carvers, and they would carve the stones, and they would ensure that as they carve the stones, they would relate their African name, or in some cases, African images. This is something that you would not see at any other African burying ground to this level as we have here in Newport. And it's also important to recognize that by very early, towards the end of the American Revolution, in fact, we know the date because we have the original records, a group of African men came together in 1780 in Newport, and they formed for the first time in world history a free African Union Society. They would reach out to African counterparts in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Providence and form similar societies. And this society did two very important things. It pooled its resources and monies together to support all Africans enslaved and free in the community, and it would pool resources to establish an African burial society. Thus, they would provide to ensure that every African, free or enslaved, would have the proper resources to have a proper burial and a proper African burial. And as I said, these African societies are formed starting in Newport, Philadelphia, Boston, and Providence. Each of these communities would have large, significant African burying grounds, which unfortunately have been lost by either neglect, vandalism, or poor public urban renewal policies. So Newport is very fortunate that it's one of the few communities that has an existing burying ground as it was laid out in markers as they were carved over the locations of actual African burials. It's also important to point out that each of these African burial societies would evolve into early free Black churches. So the connections of African burial societies, first free Black churches, as the center of Black life in worship in communities is important for us to be able to review those Black church records and go back and be able to rebuild these African burying grounds, because the church records have burial records, they have death records, they have family records. So it gives us a real key to reconnecting as we're restoring these burying grounds to these church records. So I just want to kind of conclude with and walk you through what we've been doing in documenting, recovering, restoring, and most importantly, celebrating our Godzilla Laker. And you'll just see some of the markers that we have here. I'll give you a quiz. There's one marker here that says Cujo Lopez. So Cujo should be Kojo. What day of the week was that man born on, originating from the Akan people in Ghana? And as we begin talking about documentation, one of the most important aspects of our work is to work carefully with not only Rhode Island and National Historic Archives. I've had the privilege to travel to National Archives in Curacao, Barbados, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Bahamas, and in Ghana, and be able to take the records from those locations and not only retrace the transatlantic slave trade, but reconnect African heritage people from their journey from Africa to the West Indies, and eventually to Godzilla Laker in Newport. We now have reams and reams of documentation with hundreds of names of African men, women, and children who once lived, worked, and played in 18th century America at Newport. And having these names and having the connectivity to these names brings our burial ground to life. It creates a sense of urgency, why as we understand the history of these Africans, we can also understand the history of America. In fact, it is enslaved African labor that builds America. And we're also been very fortunate, as I've said, to work with a number of different historic institutions across the diaspora. And in each and every case, they provided open access to their records, their documents, and most importantly, we've spent the time traveling back and forth and exchanging cultural and exchanging historical information. Again, the story here is not simply the story of slavery in America. It's the slavery and the enslavement of Africans across the African diaspora. We are all physically, culturally, spiritually, religiously connected through the African diaspora, and our burying ground in Newport reflects that. The recovery, we have spent years recovering markers, restoring markers. We've been fortunate to work with a number of universities. Roger Williams University worked with us and developed an entire primary secondary document assessment where we matched every existing marker and person buried there with as much information of what their life was like before dying. So now we have identification of their work, where they worship. We have dozens and dozens of colonial homes in Newport where Africans lived, worked, and worshiped, and now all connected through the primary research through Roger Williams University. Brown University has worked with us and partners to do ground penetrating radar, GIS surveys, other map surveys. So it now is giving us the ability to build websites where people can have interactive access to the stories behind each of these stones. And we're also very excited to work with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. This past year, Rhode Island signed into a law, one of the most comprehensive K-12 public schools African heritage history curriculums in the nation. This will include teacher professional development. This will include creating digital maps and portals for students and teachers. And at the very center of this working curriculum will be God's Little Acre and the stories of early Africans in Newport. The restoration work is ongoing. These are 17th and 18th century markers. So they've been very much challenged with the weather, with vandalism and neglect. We've had a series of professional artists, because this is work of art, come in and work with us largely by hand in restoring these markers. Just to give you a sense of the challenge and the time, it will take about $3,000 on the average and about 100 hours of work to restore a single slate marker. So having artists and having professional firms work with us, having access to public and private dollars to do this work has paid off, because now we have been able to stabilize, restore about 90% of the markers within God's Little Acre. The celebration piece is the fun part, because it gives us a chance to kind of show off this history and engage the community and celebrate the lives and the stories of our African ancestors. And we've been able to utilize connections with the Rhode Island Black storytellers who have come into the burying ground and actually reenacted and told the stories of African women and men and the stories and the lives that they lived. We have brought in African griots and tribal leaders, particularly representing the Akan people of Ghana and the Yoruba people of Nigeria, which very much reflects the large percentage of the Africans who were buried there. And we've had a series of programs and services, including libation ceremonies. I have the privilege to return soil from God's Little Acre back to the very spot where Africans were enslaved in Ghana through a libation ceremony. We've also worked hard with websites, training programs, and most importantly, walking tours, where we provide a series of walking tours through the Newport Historical Society, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, to give students and parents and interested parties an opportunity to physically connect with their history, African history, American history. So let me stop here and just talk about what's next. We'll be developing an interactive map of Rhode Island and African heritage history, which will center on places like God's Little Acre. We'll be developing web portals. We'll be developing a series of additional walking tours and really bringing this story to the larger public. We'll also be working with and continue to work with other countries and other locations around the United States who have asked us to come in and to assist them on providing the best practices and techniques of restoration and interpretation of our African burying grounds. And let me just stop here with one story in the stone, because we have so many markers and so many stories and so much primary documentation around those markers. But this is one of my favorite markers. My own ancestors and immediate family are buried in God's Little Acre. So this is a place that's very special to me on a very personal family level. But one of the markers since I was a child that's always attracted me is of Phyllis Stevens. Phyllis Stevens, who died in 1773 as an enslaved woman. She originated from Ghana, the Gold Coast would have been called at that time. She converts to Christianity and becomes a member of the First Congregational Church at Newport. And at the time of her death, she dies after giving birth to her son, Prince. And in her marker, which is designed by her church, you see an image of a woman holding a child. And if you look at the marker very, very carefully, she's wearing a traditional African head wrap. That's exactly what African women enslaved and free would have been wearing at that time in Newport, in America. And if you look very, very carefully at the image of the marker, you'll see the child that she's holding, the child that died soon after and is buried with her mother. It has African features. So this marker draws me, and it draws many of the visitors, because what we're looking at is not a slave, it's not chattel property, it's an African heritage woman and child, flesh and blood, real people, real lives, and those are the stories in stone that we put forth and that we celebrate in God's Little Acre. So again, thank you for letting me do 400 years of history in about 10 minutes. We're very excited in the work we do, and we're looking forward to answering any questions you might have, and I'll drop our website into the chat. Thank you for having me.
Keith, usually when we talk about these subjects, there are speakers who really literally bring tears to my eyes, and you just did that. So thank you. The work you're doing is amazing. Please put as many links as you can in the chat, because I know others would be very interested in learning more. And I'm definitely going to come visit. So thank you. That was incredible. And to all of our participants, please remember, put questions in the Q&A or the chat for Keith, Paul, or for Tyrone. So now I would like to introduce Paul LaRue, speaking about the Gist Settlement Cemetery. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. My name's Paul LaRue. I am a 30-year retired high school history teacher, and I currently serve on the Ohio State Board of Education. It's always tough when you follow two really good presentations like we've heard so far, but I'm gonna, I guess, give it my best shot. The Gist Settlement Cemetery is in, oh, I'm sorry, Lynn's helping me with this, and so we're gonna get everything going here. Well, we're froze here, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep talking. The Gist Settlement Cemetery is in southern Highland County in rural southern Ohio. We had 3 partners in this project: the Gist Settlement members themselves, the Penn Township trustees, and also my students from Washington Courthouse. The Gist Settlement Cemetery is important because it was an outgrowth of the Samuel Gist was a British merchant who had large holdings, including plantations in Virginia. And his plantations had as many as 500 slaves. Upon his death, his will stated that his plantations were to be sold, his slaves were to be free and moved to free territory. And so they were moved to rural southern Ohio. There were 4 different settlements, which included about 2,500 acres. The significance of the Gist settlement in Highland County, where my students did work, is it is the last 207 acres that is still in the direct hands of the original Gist slaves. So these are, it is in some ways, it is sacred ground because of this, because of this connection to this land that has been in literally since the 1830s. This cemetery is a little different than the 2 previous ones discussed because this is fairly well maintained. The Penn Township trustees are in charge of the cemetery and have actually done a good job. So one of the things that my students concentrated on was mapping the information. We took the information that the students found and we put it into actually, my students used a CAD program and actually made a scale model of the cemetery. Susan, we having any success here?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I just received it. I'm going to pull it up right now.
All right. Well, hey,
One minute.
I am used to teaching on the fly, so I appreciate all the help and support in getting this done. But anyhow, so one of the first things that my students did then was created a map using the data that we had. And then we kept adding to it the condition of the headstones, and in fact made an interactive map where you could click on a link, a picture of the headstone would pop up with the information about the person. One of the really neat things about this project two of my students were themselves GIST descendants. And whenever I took, whenever you take students out to do work like this, I think they always enjoy it because they're out of the classroom for a day. But I can tell you for a fact, okay, let's advance a couple here. There's the location. All right, that's what I told you about the background. Next slide, please. There's the GIST settlement. There's about 100 headstones. Next slide, please. All right, here are my students doing some mapping work. Next slide, please. This is the information that they took down, and from this they created, next slide is the map. Now this is a scale map of the cemetery, so each number, coordinates with that. And again, it was great for my students to do not only the field work, but the database work. And again, this is a scale map of the cemetery. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things we also came across, because a number of the members of the GIST community served in the Civil War. And so this is a government headstone. This is Henry Turner, who served in the 5th United States Colored Infantry. Next slide. One of the things that we figured out in our map is there were a couple of veterans who did not have headstones. And so what my students did, with the help and support of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, National Cemetery Administration, they worked on the slide. They worked on getting a.
I'm sorry, Paul, am I here?
Yeah, I'm my thing timed out. There we go. Okay, we're fine. Sorry about that. We're fine.
No worries.
Yeah, this is where the headstone should be. Okay, and so we used the information. You had to prove service, and you had to prove where they were buried. And that circle there is where there was a Civil War veteran. Next slide, please. Okay, this is one of my favorite slides. This is called "How many people does it take to dig a hole?" And the answer is a bunch, because the students really enjoyed getting out. Next slide. This is a headstone. Again, this was, with the help of the National Cemetery Administration. We thought it was important to follow the rules, and you can see the cemetery in the background there. Next slide, please. One of the neat things whenever we went down there is we interacted with lots of the folks, because they partnered with us on this. This is Mr. Paul Turner. He was a GIST. He grew up in the GIST settlement. He's a GIST descendant. He actually was a career military, came back and was kind of a caretaker and looked after the property. He was always kind of our host. He passed away 2019. And it was just such a treat for him to talk about life at the settlement. Next slide. He would always come out and visit us, and he would drive out in his tractor, and his tractor was full of dogs. And my students loved, he would open up the cab of his tractor and his dogs would jump out. And he just loved for the students to come down. He was such a great host. It was, it was wonderful for my students and I. And you can see all of his dogs. He was truly a gem for my students. Next slide. This is Janelle. This is one of my two students who was herself a GIST descendant. And it was funny, the day we drove out there, I was driving a school van and she was riding next to me. And she was a cheerleader. She sang in the choir, but she had never been to the cemetery. This is her great-grandfather's grave. And I'm going to tell you, it was such a special moment for her that day to get out there and literally be on ancestral property that it's hard for me to put into words. Next slide. Each speaker so far has mentioned, and I think it's wonderful, the use of ground penetrating radar. And then we, in fact, did this too, because one of the things we figured out is there were a number of unmarked graves. Dr. Burke's work, these are my students working with Dr. Burke's using ground penetrating radar. Dr. Burke's is standing on the left. What's interesting about him, he actually just got back this month from 6 weeks in Cambodia. He was part of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency project for recovering U.S. service members. So again, this is one of my students standing with the ground penetrating radar, or as my kids said, a $40,000 lawnmower, because that's what it looked like. Next slide. Another one of my students, and again, it was so, we talk about this, and the neat thing about as a teacher is we talk a lot about STEM and we hear STEM, to get my students to be able to use the technology, to be able to work again with somebody like Dr. Burks, who is a nationally known figure, to help preserve this. And go to the next slide and you can see, now what you see here is solid green line is a probable grave. broken dotted green line, possible grave, and then the red lines are the headstones. And I think this is pretty typical of cemeteries. If you look down in the bottom left corner, there's a lot more headstones than there are graves. And if you go to the top, you see more graves than there are headstones. And again, this is part of this honoring this cemetery and honoring these people, who had come here. Again, these were enslaved people who came here and made a life in Ohio, raised families. And again, literally, I had students in my classroom who were descendants, and I just can't, the opportunity for me was just unbelievable. Last slide. One of the other things that is I always would have a student who liked to sketch, and I can barely draw a stick person, but it was always neat to have students, kind of go to that. And as a teacher, this was one of the most powerful projects I ever had the privilege to do in my 30 years in the classroom. And so, and with all the technical things, it worked out very well. And I just want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present.
Paul, amazing, amazing. Thank you for everything that you do for your students and everything that you have done. We have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to jump right in. The first question is, Heather, do you want to ask this? Because I'm not sure if you had a particular person that you were interested in asking it of, or if it was a general question.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Heather Dene, and I am the Director of Community Engagement here at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. And we've done some preservation work on our cemetery that we own on our campus that's African American. And we found and believe that we have the first African American statues that were built in the state of Mississippi of Jim Hill and Ida Revels Redmond. And I am curious to know if there are other African American statues in the cemeteries that were presented today, because it seems like there's a contrast between knowing where and when Confederate monuments were built versus when African American monuments were built. And so I'm trying to get a better understanding of were cemeteries a safe place to have an African American statue erected, and if they are in existence in other African American cemeteries. Thank you.
Would anybody like to take that question?
I can respond. In the Gods of Lakers section, a man named Zingo Stevens, originally enslaved as Pompey and then as became free, reclaimed his African name Zingo, was trained as a stonemason and stone carver. He would carve the markers of many of his fellow African members of Newport during his lifetime. Today, scholars recognize him as one of the first African heritage artists in America because those markers are of art and significant artwork. So those physical markers themselves represent significant early African heritage monuments in testament to African artistry in early America. So thank you for the question.
Ty, I saw you come on. Would you like to answer that? Or Paul, any other comments on that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say too, another important factor too is that you have to look at locations because specifically in the area right here in Kingston, New York, it wasn't allowed during the time that enslavement was happening here. That's why one of the reasons here at the burial ground that we have here, there are no headstones. There's little plated things that's in the ground that we're finding, but it just wasn't allowed in certain areas. So a statue will be such an honor that wasn't allowed in many of the places that enslaved Africans were buried at.
Thank you.
And I would also say the cemeteries that I work with are in rural Southern Ohio. And again, same thing there. We don't have statues. We have the headstones, but we do not have any, we don't have any statues. I think largely because these are all very kind of rural cemeteries in Southern Ohio.
Great. Okay, I have several more questions from Charles. Charles, would you like to turn on your microphone and camera and ask your question? This is a great question. Excellent.
Hello? Don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question. Good to see you as well again, Paul. I wanted to know, what do you guys tell your students or other students around who may not be very well versed in the work that you do and how important it is, but how do you convey its importance to them, particularly during this period where we're politically in this area where it's so much anti-CRT, right? Critical race theory, so much demonizing of teaching slavery and the culture around slavery. So how do you motivate your students?
Well, I can start. Well, we actually have a program which we focus on ages 5 to 10-year-olds. We have structures here, which the enslaved people here actually built, and their storylines there. We actually travel with the young individuals to a lot of these sites and have like an open talk, just like we have it. And it's amazing because, you know, when you're dealing with the younger generations, they ask some of the most unique questions, and you'd be very surprised. And they actually teach you some things too as you're talking. I should throw that out there. But I think that with any type of time you're dealing with this, the presentation is always to start with who they're coming to see, and give them some feedback about why are we even here at this purpose of talking about what is enslaved people, right? And that's for the most generation of the younger generation, they always want to know what is an enslaved person. That was a lot of the questions that we got from the younger generation. But we kind of, it's a process, and I think that consistency is very important when you're dealing with younger generations, because you can't just have one segment with them and then let them go. You got to kind of continue with them. So that's why we involved with the local schools here and going in and having these talks consistently.
Let me piggyback on that and say that it is all about connecting with the students. And one of the ways that we did it was through the veterans aspect. And one of the things that my students were shocked about was all veterans don't have headstones. And a basic belief that we have is all veterans, regardless of race, gender, should have a headstone. That's the least we can do. And so that became a powerful way to talk about, hey, these are Black Civil War soldiers. They had, given their full measure. And so, this was a really neat way to engage my students, both academically and also with this, with this connecting with the culture.
Thank you. Keith, anything on that, or should we go on to the next question?
Well, what I've always said in response to CRT, slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our African heritage ancestors survived and thrived despite slavery. So the stories that we present, which are factual, documented with primary and secondary sources and bibliographical research, are the stories of the African people, how they lived, how they worked, how they worshiped, how they played, how they interacted despite the challenges of slavery and racialized discrimination. And as we present these stories of a people, any person can identify with that story. So we've been very successful in presenting the historical facts in a context that's human and that interacts at the most personal level for anyone to understand and to engage and enjoy.
Thank you. And we have a question. Well, actually, it's not so much a question, but Linda Ellis posted, Paul, to say thank you so much. What a great presentation. But she would also ask if you could please provide a website link or links to the Gist Settlement Cemetery project and the work that you have done with your students. And then,
I'll absolutely get that.
so just put that in the chat for us. That would be great. And then, Rochelle, I believe we answered your question about the veterans. So if I'm incorrect, come back on, but I think we just answered that. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat, the Q&A, and also listening. So
Hi.
sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you done?
No, I wanted to make sure we answered your question.
Yes, I think partially for Tyrone and Keith. I just wanted to know if you all had identified any unmarked graves for veterans, and I just posted a link. Paul, you're so modest. I want to thank you again. All of you did a wonderful job with your presentations, and Paul actually helped. I'm with the National Cemetery Administration, so Paul was one of the presenters in the video that we did on preserving veteran legacies, which I just posted the link in the chat. But I asked the question because it's kind of crucial that we start collecting information about veterans, specifically African American veterans who do not have unmarked graves, as he alluded to. And we're having a larger push now to, and then also in connection with Senator Brown, to establish grants and have those grants. And I'm speaking prematurely, of course, none of that is happening at this moment, but the push is to have grants or smaller grants to give to people like Tyrone and Keith and Paul to help them continue to preserve their landmarks, but also to document the veterans' legacy. Because we talk about, this huge push about service members and thank you for your service. And a lot of what's happening now with these unmarked grave sites are being, I won't say pushed under, but not being brought to light because we don't know. So if you within your research can identify those, please, by all means, I can put my information in the chat and reach out to me, or even ask Paul for his experience. He's done a lot of work, and he's really undervalued the amount of work he's done over the years with his students. But Paul and his students actually helped to identify more than 70 markers for African American Civil War veterans, and place those markers. So again, leaving, with no pun intended, but a mark, so that folks can come and identify with that portion of their ancestry.
Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank
And I
you.
just want to make sure that we did. Heather, did we answer your question completely? If you're still there, just get on, please do let me know if we answered your question completely.
Yes, you guys did. Thank you so much.
Great, I'm so happy about that. So again, everyone, please visit the chat. Make sure you collect any email addresses or websites in case you want to get in touch with these wonderful experts. And we hope to see you at our next webinar, which is April 27th. And the link is in the chat as well. And meanwhile, thank you all so very much for joining us. And a special thank you to our speakers today for your time, because it meant you took time away from this critically important work that you're doing. And we are so grateful. Thank you.